Hello and welcome to the Majlis, the podcast by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, focusing on Central Asia. I am Mohammed Tahir, your host here in Washington, D.C. Today we are back in Kyrgyzstan, and this is the second time in a month when we are discussing this topic, and it is because of the dynamic developments on the ground ahead of October 15 elections. In the latest turn of events, recently we have seen a mini scandal evolving between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan due to President Nazarbayev's meeting with the opposition presidential candidate Omurbek Babanov. Nazarbayev's intention behind the meeting, whether the meeting was useful or otherwise, to Babanov are the questions yet to be answered. However, Bishkek's reaction to the meeting made it clear that President Atambayev is not prepared to tolerate anything which could overshadow his candidate spot to the presidential office. On the other hand, regardless of what role the meeting with Nazarbayev might play, the opposition candidate Omurbek Babanov is spending millions for his campaign and obviously not prepared for anything except victory. As stakes are high, smaller parties are already in the business of discussing the post-election scenarios, and obviously they will play their role in whoever ends up winning the seat, which means this is going to be a critical elections, and questions are already looming large about post-election scenarios. So a lot to discuss in the upcoming 30-40 minutes. Before we get into the discussion, let's welcome our guests. From Boston, I'm joined by Bakit Bashimov, who is the former Kyrgyz parliamentarian, currently lecturer at the Northeastern University. From Bishkek, Roshan Jinbekov is joining us, who is also a former Kyrgyz parliamentarian, previously deputy chairman of the Atamekan Party. Bruce Pannier is with us from Prague, who is the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog called Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you. Obviously, a lot to talk about external factors in Kyrgyz elections, especially after the mini scandal involving Nazarbayev's meeting with Babanov and follow-up the reactions by Kyrgyzstan. But let's keep that topic aside for a while. Now, since our last discussion, where we are in terms of domestic politics, what Babanov is doing and how Jinbekov is performing, anything new worthwhile as election day looming large? Bruce, you had a rundown piece on this, I think, yesterday. Let's start with you.
You know, I love Kyrgyz elections because they're always, you got to expect the unexpected. And certainly these ones are moving all around the place at the moment. You know, there's a Bakit Torobayev from Oynugu Progress. He's the leader, and he seems to have thrown his support behind Babanov, and there's been reports that they've worked out this deal where if Babanov wins, then Torobayev would become the prime minister. Although I'm not exactly sure how that works, because of course you still have to go through a parliamentary process to be selected prime minister. But anyway, so that's already one change. And then we have Kamchibek Tashiev, the head of the Atajurt party, who was a presidential candidate, and he dropped his candidacy entirely and threw his support behind Soronbay Jeenbekov. So, you know, we got two candidates out of the 13 who seem to have already agreed that they're no longer going to participate, but are looking for something probably after the election is over. And then we have other signs from a couple of the other potentially strong candidates. We know Adahan Madomarov appeared at a campaign rally that Babanov had in the south, in the town of Uzgen. And we also know that, Timur Tsariev, who was another one of the prime ministers under Atambayev, and also the head of the Akshumkar party, has his campaign manager left and not just his campaign manager, but other members of the campaign team left because of differences over ideology or political strategy. And there's been, ever since that happened, there's been rumors that maybe Sariev is in talks with other people, although I know that he today at least denied that he's in talks with the Jeenbekov camp at the moment. So, you know, this is, I mean, those are, that's four of the six big people right there. You know, I know we discussed this just a couple weeks ago and kind of agreed that, you know, Soronbay Jeenbekov and Omurbek Babanov were really the two main candidates. Yeah. And the four other candidates who still had a pretty strong bid have now their status, except for Tashiev, who's dropped out of the race entirely. It seems like they're kind of in negotiations with various political parties and the front runners to try to see what they might get for throwing their support behind the candidates.
Okay, let's get Bakit's point on this. To follow up, Bruce, Bakit, what these changes are explaining to you, especially the shaping political alliances, given that we are talking today only about these two front runners?
By now, we see that attractiveness of Kyrgyz election in unpredictability, but day by day, unpredictability is decreasing. And in my view, we see today only two candidates who have real chances to win. It's a candidate of Atambayev, Jeenbekov, and entire state resources working in order to support him. And it is visible for those who are closely observing this election. And Babanov, who uses, as you said, a lot of money, and today in a desperate attempt to mobilize votes to the south of Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. Let's get Roshan Jeenbekov from Bishkek, although no relations to Jeenbekov, the candidate, right?
No, just the same surname, have different political views. We belong to opposition and government.
Yeah, we are talking in outside, as a Kyrgyzstan observers from outside, we are talking about two main candidates, someone who have the chance to win the election. Is it objective?
Yes,
is it an objective observation?
The result of this election in Kyrgyzstan is unpredictable. It's very interesting for Central Asia. I think it's first time in our region because we don't know who's going to be the president of Kyrgyzstan. The candidate of government or President Atambayev or their opponent, candidate of Babanov. Babanov has a lot of money. He's one of the main oligarchs in Kyrgyzstan, and he's fighting with oligarch power in Kyrgyzstan. Now, Babanov has many supporters from opposition and neutral politicians, but President candidate Sooronbay Jeenbekov, he accumulated all state support, state resources, money, and big Atambayev's team, and as well as money too.
Right. The question of use of administrative resources, Bakit, become kind of controversial, especially the resources used in favor of Atambayev as candidate. What is the scope of that, and is it in a level to influence the outcome?
Yes, sure. Are you asking me?
Let's get Bakit's point, then we will continue with you.
I think that without administrative resources and money, Jeenbekov as a candidate of Atambayev cannot be, and it is obvious. And therefore, Atambayev uses administrative resources on a different levels. For instance, Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan just in an first official visit to Russia. And from the interview and talk with Medvedev, Kyrgyz people in Kyrgyzstan getting information that a Russian Prime Minister would like the continuation of the political course of Atambayev. It's very interesting. It's just how they are trying to influence to the choice of the people in Kyrgyzstan. Secondly, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kyrgyzstan has sent a note to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan, just accusing Kazakhstan for just attempt to influence to the choice of the people of Kyrgyzstan. And in my view, it was a wrong move, but it became clear that Atambayev just would like to succeed even at the expense of worsening relations with Kazakhstan. And thirdly, we can see that local administrations, state media, and all public institutions of Kyrgyzstan working for the promotion of candidacy of Jeenbekov. But on our side, we can see also, as I said, the desperate attempt of Babanov to get the votes in the south of Kyrgyzstan. And in my opinion, recently he made two big mistakes. And it seems to me he just decreased his chances to win.
What's that?
The first, it is his speech in the Uzbek community. And of course, the people can analyze this speech from different points of view. But given, let's say, the mentality of local people and understanding the situation in South Kyrgyzstan, I mean ethnic relations, it seems to me it is a very sensitive issue, and therefore it is very dangerous to jeopardize, let's say, more or less stable relation between two ethnic groups. As Babanov, unfortunately, just made some wrong remarks. And I think that, let's say, ordinary Kyrgyz people in the south will accept this as big mistake. He favors, let's say, our ethnic minority at the expense of the majority of the population.
Is that what he said about it?
I am just taking into account how ordinary voters can react to this speech. Of course, we can say that nothing wrong in his words, and he just called people for the friendship and the peace, and he did that.
Good. I know, Roshan, you want to record your point of view on this, but I will come back to you just in a minute. But first, Bruce, we were talking about this before the discussion started, the speech by the Babanov in southern Kyrgyzstan. Let's make it clear what was the wording and why it is so sensitive.
You know, I've heard different reports about exactly what the wording was. The black PR that they tried to spread on him made it sound like he was trying to tell the Uzbeks that, that they needed to stand up a little bit more for themselves and be a little bit more forceful in trying to get, the equal rights in Kyrgyzstan. They said that was like early reports this morning. That apparently is not what he said. He has a very different version of this that he just appealed to them. It was more a thing of, we're citizens of Kyrgyzstan and you are too. And there really shouldn't have been that much of a controversy over that. But like I said, the way it was reported immediately, and obviously this is because his political opponents got to the media much faster than he did, it kind of made it sound like he was, encouraging the Uzbeks to be a little more visible out there. And I know that immediately this got sent to or got brought up in Bishkek about whether he wasn't trying to foment interethnic hatred. So yes, there was that to it, and now it's just a question of will his message be able to override the initial reports, which appear to be false, about his statement, so that people remember what he really said and not what they heard he said at first, which was portrayed unfairly, I think.
This is what we were talking about, the black PR, the compromise. So, Roshan, what is your take on this? How serious this comment was? And is it, as Bakit is saying, could lead to some unexpected outcome for Babanov?
I would agree with Mr. Bakit Bishemov because he knows the situation very well. I think opposition candidate made a very big mistake because ethnical problem is one of the big, very sensitive problems in Kyrgyzstan. In general, I wouldn't say that he told wrong speech. He was saying just about problems with police and Uzbek minority in Kyrgyzstan, in Osh, in Jalalabad. But Soranbay Jeenbekov's team or government team just used his speech and they cut his speech from a general speech and they are using as a black PR, as a compromise against candidate Babanov. And really, maybe intelligence people will understand that black PR is here. Mr. Babanov was right in general, but ordinary people, ordinary voters, they believe to state mass media and they think that Babanov is wrong And Babanov is making problems between Uzbek people and Kyrgyz people. Today, few organizations and few people, they accused Babanov and they applied to state election committee, accusing Babanov that he's organizing inter-ethnic problem and he must be punished and maybe kicked out from election.
Interesting. No,
if I could just jump in and say one thing here, though, it's not to defend anyone, but in particular on this, but the Uzbek bloc, of course, is an important bloc to try to get at the moment. Now we know that there's about 3 million eligible voters in Kyrgyzstan, of which 600,000 to 700,000 are outside the country, and of course these are mainly working age people, eligible voters. So they're not going to vote. So it's more like 2.3 million, and there's 700,000 or 800,000 Uzbeks in the south. So this, for all candidates, this is an appealing group that they would like to get on their side. And of course, you have to be very sensitive about how you're going to treat this, and what kind of promises you're going to make or what kind of speech you're going to give to them and stuff. But you can't. They didn't vote in big numbers in 2015 parliamentary elections, but they could be a big deciding factor in who's going to win this election, so they can't be ignored right now. And any candidate that seriously wants to win is going to have to consider going and making appeals to them and speaking to them and trying to get them on their side.
Yeah.
Here, what, in my view, important. Today, representatives of Uzbek community organized press conference in Osh, and they just blame Babanov. Of course, we can say that Kyrgyz authorities who intentionally used against Babanov as a black PR. But we should just understand that wounds of 2010 ethnic conflicts are not healed.
Yeah.
Therefore, it takes time. And during the election, it is important for the candidates to just talk to people in a more balanced way. Mm-hmm. And after that, today, a lot of people asking the question, okay, you was the prime minister, you was the vice prime minister, you was the, and you're still leader of a fraction in a parliament, or was many time AMP in a parliament. Yeah. And during all these years, you just said nothing serious about ethnic relations. And why right now, during election, you started to talk so emotional about that? Therefore, I assess his speech as a big mistake.
Yeah, no, obviously the authorities are also highlighting this simply because to divert focus from real issues, which is use of administrative resources by Jeenbekov comments. That was actually my intention to focus on that little bit. Staying in the south, obviously, a few days ago I have seen some religious leaders are also in the political rallies, who was the former, I think, Mufti Jalilov, speaking in favor of Jeenbekov, and there were some controversy surrounding his endorsement. What was that? How important of development was that, Roshan?
Yes, you are right. Now, both of them main presidential candidates, they are trying to use religious leaders. For example, Soronbay Jeenbekov, he was trying to use former Mufti, former leader of Kyrgyz Islamic Center, Chubak Hacı Jalilov. And many organizations against applied to election committee, but the election committee did nothing about this. Secondly, candidate Babanov used former Mufti Sadıkjan Kamalov in his election to support him. And this is the second case when candidates were using religious leaders. But many organizations, many people, they are applying to election committee, but they did nothing regarding both of them. This is a big problem in our presidential election now. We couldn't solve this problem.
Is it important? What role the religious figures play? Maybe, Bucket, you want to jump in here. What is the trick behind using religious figures in this election?
If we look at, let's say, political developments in Kyrgyzstan since 2010, we can see that these Kyrgyz authorities, in a different ways, actually paving the way for the further Islamization of Kyrgyzstan. And therefore, today, they must reckon with the fact that Islamic clerics play big role in mobilization of electorate. And it is just, it seems to me, the beginning of very interesting, complex, and let's say hard to predict consequences process. And both sides trying to use local imams, clerics, and they are just visiting mosques. And of course, they're trying to use those who control madrasas and try to get their votes. After that, when you ask question about how Kyrgyz authorities employing administrative resources, we should just use this very famous phrase saying deal in the details. If look at the details closely, we can see that today Atambayev, Jeenbekov political camp, controls all local electoral commissions, all. They control all the Kyrgyz public institutions who are just focused on the mobilization of electorate. Thirdly, they are using technologies in order just to understand the preferences of the people, and after that, just accommodate their interest in this election through the, let's say, smart usage of these technologies. I mean, this is a system employed by the Kyrgyz Central Election Commission. Until now, nobody, let's say, as an independent commission, morally checked credibility of this system.
Yeah.
And I have a suspicion that this system could be used and could be in the interest of a certain groups who are in power and in the interest of the presidential camp.
Bruce Pakit pointed into a very interesting point, the credibility of the system. Also, the role of election commission in this, by law, candidates, I believe, shouldn't use religious figures in the election campaigns. Also, use of administrative resources is something which I think is against the law. And then there are allegations, at least, some candidates are bribing potential voters to vote in their favor. And what else? There were many other kind of allegations floating around. So what role the election commission is playing in this?
Well, of course, early on, this has been a big problem for this campaign, is that there have been a number of appeals to the Central Election Commission, and Ravshan, for instance, will certainly know Atamakhen has been practically camped out at the Central Election Commission office there while the Atamakhen leader, Omurbek Tekibayev, was on trial because they were trying to get some kind of ruling on while the process was going on, could he at least keep progressing to get himself set up to be a candidate, namely in this case to take the mandatory Kyrgyz language test. And and the Central Election Commission kept delaying on a decision and coming back and forth. They wanted the courts to decide it instead of them, and strangely, right about the time Tekibayev finally gets sentenced to jail, they decide that he can take the language test, but then they disqualify him later because of his signatures. And this has come up again and again with the Central Election Commission. Every time someone makes an appeal to them, they delay, or they just find, like in the case of, I know we're going to get to Babanov and Nazarbayev here soon, but they decide that there's been no foul, to use like a sports term. They consider it and go, no, we don't see that this is a violation, although they'll give a warning to the candidates about trying to be careful. So, their role should be a lot more clear and a lot more forceful, I think, in what's been happening, because they're not really helping to run the campaign process very well. They get complaints, and then they have a hard time trying to figure out what they're going to decide. Even, as we just heard, the former Mufti, Jalilov, he gave a speech of support for Jeenbekov's candidacy. Well, Article 22 of the Election Code specifically states that religious figures are not supposed to be involved in campaigning for candidates. And then of course so now this would be a clear decision where the Central Election Commission should step in and say that was a violation. But the Jayinbekov campaign team answered back that Jalilov was not there on the invitation of Jayinbekov. He was there on the invitation of Kamchibek Chashiev, and he wasn't supposed to speak, but a group of workers who happened to be at the campaign rally really wanted to hear from him, and it was just a coincidence that he got up on stage and said that he would throw his support behind Jayinbekov. So, the Central Election Commission should be a lot more clear and a lot more aggressive in addressing these issues.
These are the local dynamics in the ongoing elections, but over the last few days, we have also seen external actors, especially Nazarbayev's recent meeting with Babanov, become a sort of political storm in Kyrgyzstan. Also, where is Russia and Uzbekistan standing in this battle? And most importantly, as both Jayinbekov and Babanov are fighting tooth and nail in this, what are the post-election scenario? We will continue the debate discussing this and many other questions shortly. Hey everyone, before we get into the second part of the show, just a quick reminder that if you really like Majlis podcast, there's a real chance that you will also like my other radio show that's called Gandhara Podcast. The show discusses latest developments in Pakistan and Afghanistan from local perspective. And the podcast is published in every second week on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Gandhara website. It's a totally must-follow discussion for foreign policy nerds with interest in the region. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia podcast, we are discussing local and regional dynamics in Kyrgyzstan's forthcoming elections and its implications. Joining me in the debate are Bakit Bashimov, former Kyrgyz parliamentarian, currently lecturer at the Northeastern University in Boston. From Bishkek, Roshan Jayinbekov is joining us, who's also a former Kyrgyz parliamentarian, previously deputy chairman of Atamekan Party. Bruce Pannier is with us from Prague. He is the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog called Kishlak Owazi. I am Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis here in Washington, D.C. Welcome back, gentlemen, on the Majlis. So let us straight get into Nazarbayev factor here. I guess partially his meeting with Babanov and follow-up scandal is what prompted us to get back to this topic today. But first, just a few days ahead of the election, Bakit, why Nazarbayev met with Babanov? I'm sure he knew that it is going to be controversial. So what is the logic behind it from Nazarbayev's point of view?
I can only assume, and would like just to stress with this, my assumptions. Mm-hmm. I didn't see serious evidence that Nazarbayev really prefer to deal with Atambayev. And he paid a lot of attention to the membership of Kyrgyzstan in the Eurasian Union, and he focused on Kyrgyzstan. But personally, I assume he wasn't so happy with Atambayev. And my well-informed sources in Astana telling me that the leader of Kazakhstan prefer a new page in the politics of Kyrgyzstan. And therefore, I do believe that this meeting with Babanov as the main candidate, in his view, he supposed, in my view, as important. And through this, indirectly to just influence to the choice of the people of Kyrgyzstan.
Okay, so follow-up question, Baki. So did he achieve what he was intending for by this meeting? Nazarbayev.
Difficult to just predict how ordinary people in Kyrgyzstan will react this fact. But if, for instance, Babanov would not make a mistake about which I mentioned, probably his meeting with Nazarbayev would be useful for his campaign. But today, I have doubts that this meeting can, let's say, be as one of the decisive factors in his attempts to win.
Okay. I don't know, Roshan, if you agree with what Bakit has just said about the meeting between Babanov and Nazarbayev. Feel free to comment on that. But my question is, let's look at this from the other side, from Babanov's side. Was this meeting useful for him?
It's very difficult to predict it was useful or not, but in my mind, I think it's 50-50 because going to President Nazarbayev, maybe Babanov win some maybe PR campaign, showing or saying that he has very good relations with one of the big Central Asian leaders. But on the other hand, I would say that in local mass media, he lost his reputation because all state-controlled mass media showed that candidate Babanov is oligarch and he's going to President Nazarbayev through Kazakhstan's oligarchs and he's gonna sell all Kyrgyz mineral resources and to all Kyrgyz national interest to Kazakhstan and Kazakh oligarchs. And ordinary people, they made their decision, to my mind, and I heard many of them that they believe to state mass media announces on Babanov's accusation. But on another idea, many people think that President Nazarbayev is just a mediator between Kremlin and Kyrgyz election. Maybe later President Nazarbayev will ask President Putin to support candidate Babanov. In this case, candidate Babanov has very big chance to win Soronbay Jeenbekov, Atambayev's predictor.
Bruce, that is what Roshan is saying, very interesting, about the possibility of Nazarbayev convincing Russia to get involved in this. Do you see, or maybe it is my guess, is it already happening? Because just a day or two ago, our Kyrgyz service was reporting about some Russian media news cycle which is, as far as going to link Jeenbekov to some radical cells in the Middle East. What was into this?
Yes, I did hear about that. And it wasn't Jeenbekov himself that was linked to these groups, as at least in the stuff that I read, it was his brothers. But since they're all from the same family, I suppose they figured that that was a close enough link that they could draw to this. So yeah, and it's not just the attacks on Jeenbekov in the Russian media. I mean, lately there've been a lot of reports that if you didn't know what was happening in Kyrgyzstan or weren't watching it every day, you would get the impression that the place was close to falling apart. That it wasn't being run very well, that it was a haven for various extremists. And this is all things, reports that have come out in Russian media in the last couple of weeks. So, we're not seeing the higher profile Russian presence that we would have seen, in 2010 or something, when they pretty much worked as hard as they could to get Bakiyev out, and then also to prevent Tekibayev from doing better in elections later that year in the Atamakhen party, Tekibayev in the Atamakhen party. So they're much more quiet about it this time, but obviously they are not indifferent to what's happening in Kyrgyzstan. And the media, once again, the Russian soft power, is at work trying to pick away at this. And let's be fair, it's not even the elections. When Atambayev has made visits to Russia, there have been some media outlets who have portrayed him very poorly after coming to Moscow and meeting with Putin and made him look like he really wasn't a very strong leader or wasn't in control. This is not new, but it's getting more pronounced. And of course, it's more important because we're close to elections now.
Yeah, well, Russia is already in the business.
May I add to this? Given that all attempts of different political groups or personalities to use Nazarbayev as mediator with the Kremlin failed, please, I would like to remind about the Crimea situation with Ukraine. I don't see any rationale to have Nazarbayev as a mediator because Kremlin and Putin personally prefers very, direct relation, and Putin does not want to have anyone, and especially Nazarbayev, as a mediator.
Okay,
no,
so from your...
I see a rationale in that.
Okay, so from your point, Bakit, about the other thing that we are talking about, Russia's position in this election, what role do you see Russia is playing? Who Moscow is siding with?
After reading all these newspaper articles in the newspapers, in Russian newspapers, after the visit of Atambayev. I tend to estimate all these articles as attempted to keep leaders of Kyrgyzstan as little brothers. It's just a colonial mentality. We are trying to show the place of this Kyrgyz leader, just telling that they are not equal to talk directly with Putin and so on. And in my view, it's really disrespectful observation of done by the Russian journalist.
Okay.
But Russia today should not, and it, in my view, does not nervous about the outcomes of this election, because among the candidates, you can see that they are competing for the sympathy of the Kremlin. They would like just convince Kremlin that they can be more loyal to Kremlin than Atambayev. And therefore, Kremlin just thinking idly, okay, whom we can pick up as the next little brother, whom we will use as we wish in our own interest. Therefore, I don't see that Russia is really very much concerned with the results of this election.
Interesting observation, Bruce.
Let me add some idea.
Sure.
I would say that Mr. Beshim is absolutely right. All candidates, especially main candidates, all of them absolutely pro-Russian, and they are looking for sympathy of Kremlin, and they are fighting for presidential power. The last word in the question of who is going to be president of Kyrgyzstan belongs to Kremlin. And now we are going to conflict because candidate Babanov is enough strong, he's enough reach, and he invested too much money to this election. President Atambayev candidate Jeenbekov is using money and power, and of course we are going to conflict. And in this conflict, who will get support of Kremlin, that candidate will win.
Who has the chance of getting that sympathy from Kremlin among at least these two?
It's very difficult to find out now, but one of the main indicators of who got support from Kremlin will be Russian mass media, first-line mass media, like ORT, RTR, and NTV. Not like second line like Rosbalt or Regnum.
Okay.
They are good, but they are not indicators.
Okay, we will keep eye on that. Now, Bruce, I cannot avoid the other actor there, the strange handshake between Babanov and Mirziyoyev during his visit to Kyrgyzstan. Tell us, please, is there anything to read into this?
I mentioned this in the last podcast, too. It was a very curious event, that's for sure. And I wasn't the only one that wondered why, when he was meeting all the party leaders, all of a sudden he chose to stop for a few extra seconds and actually make a comment to Babanov. It certainly shows an Uzbek interest in what's happening in the country. And Mirziyoyev, I'm sure the Uzbek government has a lot of people in Kyrgyzstan that are giving them information. So it's entirely possible that what Mirziyoyev had been hearing up before his visit to Kyrgyzstan had led him to believe that Babanov was a solid candidate and had a really good chance of being elected. And therefore, it was worth acknowledging him in a way that he did not acknowledge the other people in the room during that meeting. But, at the same time, it wasn't like you couldn't call it an endorsement, certainly. It was just a curious moment when he decided he would actually say something to Babanov, besides good to meet you, which was basically what he was saying to everyone else, and said, there's something I've heard about you. What that was that he heard about him, he didn't say, and we still don't know. But it did show that, in the past, of course, President Karimov, when he was alive, it's doubtful. He certainly wouldn't have come right before elections, but he hadn't made a trip to Kyrgyzstan in a long time. And he took a different view of, if he wanted to influence the politics in Kyrgyzstan, he was much more aggressive and straightforward in his statements about discontent with policies in Kyrgyzstan. He wouldn't have gone to the trouble of going over there and making a curious comment to a potential or to a presidential candidate. So it shows a new interest on Uzbekistan's part and maybe a new tactic in how they treat Kyrgyzstan and its internal politics.
Yeah. Bakit, I'm coming to you. At least in this point, we don't see anyone talking in Washington about the elections in Kyrgyzstan, I believe, right?
I got information that it was talked 2 days ago about Kyrgyz elections, but I don't have details of this talk. I don't think that Washington today very much interested in the outcomes of Kyrgyz election, besides of just a general desire to see democracy and free alternative elections in Kyrgyzstan. And as I said in our previous talk, in my view, the Western observers just after this election will mention that in comparison with Turkmenistan and all our Central Asian countries, Kyrgyzstan made one step forward. But returning to the handshake of Mirziyoyev with Babanov, I think if someone who are against Babanov will make a video with this handshake and
it's going to be another scandal.
Yes, and combine it with his speech in Osh, they can crush all chances of Babanov to get good votes in the south.
Wow, interesting. Now, we are already over time. So just final question. Now, the biggest question of all on the meeting between Babanov and Nazarbayev, or whether the handshake between Mirziyoyev and Babanov will play any role. But on Nazarbayev meeting, Atambayev seen it as an interference. And with his reaction, he also indicated that he won't compromise anything in the way to Jeenbekov's victory. On the other hand, as we discussed, Babanov is spending millions to get to the presidency, so stakes are really, really high. How do you see the post-election scenario? Very shortly, please. Let's start with you, Roshan.
I already told that the last word in this election, who will be president, or if there will be conflicts between two candidates, how conflict will be decided belongs to Kremlin. Because candidate Babanov is very breach man, and he knows that if he will lose, he will have too many problems with safety of his life or political future and his money. And in this case, the guarantee of Kremlin is the main thing in his future.
Yeah. The same question to you, Bakit, and I will also add that even today the election commission becomes controversial. So how do you see the day after the election? Do you see an indication of any chaos in the country?
We can predict some destabilization, but given the chances of main opposition candidate Babanov is day by day is getting slim, I think it will not be so dangerous. And after that, Atambayev uses mistakes of opponents very smartly. He just recently, again, just distributed free housing for police, and this is official visit of the Prime Minister to Moscow. And after that, highlighted Jeenbekov as number one guy in the village. I don't see any serious destabilization after election. And I can say today that for me personally, the outcomes of this election is becoming clear. Who will be?
Who is you say, Jeenbekov?
Of course.
Okay, Bruce, your point, shortly, please.
Well, we still got 2 weeks, and as we've, just the last 2 weeks, things have changed a lot. So it's hard to say. I would agree that Babanov's chances seem to be diminished a little bit. Both candidates are throwing everything at this that they possibly can, and there is, no matter who wins, the other side is going to have a claim for why this was an unfair election. If Jeenbekov wins, as a lot of people expect, then Babanov supporters are going to say it's because administrative resources and it was never a fair election to start with. And if Babanov wins, then a lot of people on the Jeenbekov camp are going to say it was outside interference, and so you are going to have some very dissatisfied people in Kyrgyzstan on October 16th. Once the election results are in. Now, how that's going to manifest itself, we'll have to see. I wouldn't predict anything like 2005 or 2010, but no matter who wins, they're going to have section of the public that doesn't approve of the way they got the victory, and that's going to be something that's going to complicate their presidency.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your insight, Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog called Kishlok Owazi, and big thanks to Bakit Bashimov, former Kyrgyz parliamentarian and currently professor at the Northeastern University in Boston, and Roshan Jinbekov, former Kyrgyz parliamentarian and previously deputy chairman of Atambakan Party in Kyrgyzstan, for your time and thoughts, gentlemen, today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this is it from me, Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia podcast. Until next week, bye-bye.